an old man, alone on a rock, with a lighthouse as his only companion. The sea remembers the daughter he lost, and the promise he couldn't keep. Welcome to Real Frame Stories, where we keep and retell the most touching, most truthful stories. And sometimes, stories no one believes could be real. The foghorn groaned, a low, mournful sound swallowed by the dense mist rolling in from the sea. It was a thick fog, the kind that clung to the island like a shroud, blurring the line between the slate-gray water and the bruised evening sky. Salt spray ghosted across the window panes of the lighthouse keeper's cottage, leaving trails like tears on dusty glass. Inside, Elias sat by the hearth, the fire long dead, its ashes cold and gray like the stubble on his chin. He wasn't mending nets or polishing brass today. He was just sitting, the worn wooden chair creaking faintly under his weight, listening to the sea sigh against the rocks below. It was a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat, a constant, rhythmic whisper that held echoes of laughter, of storms, and of one terrible silence that had stretched across 20 years. 20 years. The thought settled in his chest, heavy as an anchor. 20 years since Alara, his bright, sea-loving Alara, had been taken by the waves. Not during a storm, no. That he could have perhaps understood, cursed the fury of the ocean, and eventually found peace. But she'd been taken on a calm day, a day like this one, swallowed by a sudden inexplicable swell while playing near the cove. Her small red ribbon, the last thing he saw bobbing on the surface, before it too vanished. He'd searched, frantically, desperately, until the tide turned and the Coast Guard boat arrived, their sympathetic glances confirming what his heart already knew. She was gone. And with her, the light in his own life seemed to dim, leaving only the steady, cyclical beam of the lighthouse he tended. He ran a hand over the smooth, cool surface of a small wooden bird resting on the windowsill. Alara's last carving. Her small hands had worked the driftwood with surprising skill, mimicking the gulls that wheeled above their island home. "For you, Papa," she'd said, her eyes bright as the sea on a sunny morning, "so you won't be lonely when the light turns." He hadn't been lonely then, not truly. But now the silence in the stone tower was a living thing, pressing in on him, filled only by the sea's mournful song and the rhythmic sweep of the lamp above. Tonight, the fog was different, heavier. It carried a scent. Not just salt and damp rock, but something else. Wood smoke? An unlikely smell, miles from the mainland. Elias pushed himself up, his old bones protesting. He walked to the window, wiping away the condensation. Out in the swirling gray, near the treacherous western shoals where ships feared to tread, a faint light flickered. Not the steady pulse of a ship's navigation light, but something small, desperate. A fire. On a boat? Adrift? His mind raced. No radio calls, no distress flares, just that tiny, struggling spark against the overwhelming gray. Protocol demanded he radio the Coast Guard, report the sighting, but something held him back. An instinct, perhaps, or maybe just the weariness of a man who had seen too much of the sea's indifference. He picked up his heavy oilskin coat, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders. "Just a look," he muttered to the empty room, the sound swallowed by the foghorn's next mournful call. Just a quick look. The climb down the winding stone steps to the small jetty was treacherous in the mist, the rocks slick with damp. The sea churned below, slapping against the granite with a hungry sound. He untied the painter of his small, sturdy dory, the Alara, its name faded but still visible on the transom. He rowed out, pulling against the swell, the fog closing in around him, isolating him in a world of gray sound and muffled water. The flickering light seemed further than he'd thought, pulling him towards the shoals. As he drew closer, shapes began to emerge from the mist. Not a fishing vessel, not a yacht. It was a small, crudely made raft, little more than planks lashed together. And huddled on it, beside a sputtering fire built in a metal bucket, were two figures. A woman, her face pale and drawn, clutching a small bundle wrapped in soaked blankets. A child. Elias shipped his oars, letting the dory drift the last few yards. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. The child coughed, a weak, rattling sound that tore at Elias's carefully constructed solitude. "Help us," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please, the engine died. We've been adrift days." He didn't ask questions, didn't ask where they came from or why they were out here on such a flimsy craft. He saw only the desperation in her eyes, the vulnerability of the child. It mirrored the fear he'd felt 20 years ago, staring out at an empty ocean. He maneuvered the dory alongside, his movements practiced and sure despite the tremor in his hands. "Get in," he said, his voice gruff from disuse. "Carefully now." He helped the woman aboard, her body almost weightless with exhaustion. Then, gently, he took the bundle from her. The blankets fell away slightly, revealing the small, pale face of a little girl, no older than Alara had been. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. For a moment, Elias's breath caught. The resemblance. It was fleeting, a trick of the mist and memory, but it struck him like a physical blow. He wrapped the blankets tighter, shielding the child from the damp chill. As he rowed back towards the lighthouse, the woman huddled in the stern, shivering. She didn't speak, just watched him with those wide, haunted eyes. The fire on the raft sputtered and died, leaving only the swirling fog and the rhythmic groan of Elias's oars in the rowlocks. He felt a conflict rising within him. He was a lighthouse keeper. His duty was to the light, to the ships navigating the dangerous waters. Bringing strangers to the island, especially ones who appeared from nowhere like sea wraiths, was against every regulation. It invited questions, complications. It risked the solitary, predictable peace he had built around his grief. "What am I doing?" The thought was a cold splash of seawater. "This isn't my concern. Report it. Let the authorities handle it." He looked down at the child in his arms. Her small hand had unconsciously curled around his finger, a tiny anchor in the vast sea of his loneliness. He thought of Alara's wooden bird, waiting on the windowsill. "So you won't be lonely." He pulled harder on the oars, the dory cutting through the gray water towards the faint, welcoming glow of the lighthouse lamp. He didn't know who these people were, or what dangers they might bring. He only knew that tonight he couldn't leave them to the fog and the sea. He had failed to save his own daughter from the waves. Perhaps he could offer this small, flickering life a temporary harbor. It wasn't a rescue, not yet. It was a choice. A painful, uncertain turning point, made in the heart of the mist, guided only by the ghost of a child's touch and the distant, steady beam of his light. Back in the warmth of the cottage kitchen, the woman, Maria, she whispered her name, drank hot tea, her hands trembling around the mug. The little girl, Leah, slept wrapped in dry blankets near the revived hearth, her breathing evening out in the warmth. Maria spoke haltingly, her English accented, telling a fragmented story of fleeing a bad situation, a desperate sea crossing gone wrong. Elias listened, not judging, just providing warmth, food, silence. He knew he should radio the mainland now, report their arrival. But looking at Leah sleeping, the vulnerability in Maria's eyes, he hesitated. Reporting them meant authorities, questions, separation, perhaps sending them back to whatever they fled. It meant shattering this fragile sanctuary. He thought of his own loss, the bureaucratic sympathy that felt like sandpaper on raw grief. Could he subject them to that? His inner conflict was a silent storm within the stone walls. Duty versus compassion. Rules versus humanity. The memory of Alara, the weight of his lonely promise to keep the light burning, wrestled with the unexpected wretched reality of the child sleeping by his fire. He looked from the sleeping girl to the steady beam sweeping across the misty window. The light was constant, impartial, a guide. But what did it guide him to do now? Days turned into a week. Elias kept his secret. He taught Maria how to manage the stores, how to listen to the weather in the wind's voice. He showed Leah the seabirds, helped her find smooth gray stones on the beach, much like he had with Alara. A fragile routine settled over the island. The silence was still there, but it was different now, punctuated by a child's tentative laughter, a woman's quiet humming. Leah began to smile, her eyes losing their haunted look. She started leaving small gifts for Elias. A perfect seashell, a feather, a drawing of the lighthouse made with charcoal from the hearth. One evening, sitting by the fire, Leah asleep on the rug, Maria looked at Elias, her eyes clear for the first time. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why help us? You risk everything." Elias looked at the small wooden bird on the windowsill. He picked it up, turning it over in his calloused hands. "I lost my daughter," he said, the words rough, unfamiliar after years of silence. "To the sea, long ago." He paused, the admission hanging in the warm air. "The sea takes, but maybe sometimes it gives back too. Not the same, but something." He didn't offer explanations, didn't confess his breach of duty. He just shared a sliver of his own enduring pain. It was enough. Maria nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. An understanding passed between them, deeper than words. The next morning, the fog lifted. Bright sunlight glittered on a calm sea, and in the distance, the unmistakable shape of a Coast Guard cutter approached. Elias's heart clenched. They had been spotted. The secret was over. He woke Maria and Leah gently. "They're here," he said simply. There was fear in Maria's eyes, but also a strange calmness. Leah clung to Elias's hand. As the cutter docked and uniformed officers stepped onto the jetty, Elias met them. He didn't make excuses. He stated the facts simply. He had found them adrift, sheltered them. He handed over his logbook, knowing the omission would be noted. The lead officer looked from Elias to Maria and Leah, then back at the old keeper's weathered face. He saw the lighthouse, impeccably kept. He saw the cottage, clean and warm. He saw the small girl hiding shyly behind the keeper's legs, clutching a wooden bird. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the gulls crying overhead. "Foundlings?" the officer said finally, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Brought in by the tide, looks like. We'll take them ashore, get them processed, see they get the help they need." He didn't ask about the delay in reporting. He didn't mention regulations. Perhaps he, too, understood the sea and the strange currents of the human heart. Elias watched them board the cutter. Maria turned back, meeting his gaze. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. Leah waved, her small hand opening and closing like a starfish. Elias raised his hand in return, a gesture stiff with unshed emotion. He stood on the jetty long after the cutter was a speck on the horizon. The island was silent again. The lighthouse beam began its sweep as dusk approached. He walked back to the cottage. It felt empty, the silence heavier than before. But as he sat in his chair, he saw it. Leah had left her charcoal drawing of the lighthouse on the table, and beside it, nestled against Alara's wooden bird, was one perfect, gray, smooth stone. The sea had taken his daughter. It had brought strangers to his door. He had broken rules, risked his solitary life. It wasn't a perfect ending. Maria and Leah faced an uncertain future. His own loneliness returned, vast as the ocean. But something had shifted within the old stone walls, within himself. A flicker of warmth against the long chill of grief. He hadn't replaced what was lost, but he had opened the door, offered a hand, shared his light not just from the lamp, but from the fractured, healing parts of his own heart. He picked up the smooth gray stone, its coolness familiar in his palm. The foghorn groaned, but tonight it sounded less like mourning and more like a long, slow breath. The light turned, steady and constant, sweeping out over the now clear water, holding its vigil. And in the quiet cottage, an old man held a stone and a wooden bird, no longer completely alone. Elias sat quietly in the stone cottage, the oil lamp flickering gently in the sea breeze. On the table, Leah's charcoal drawing of the lighthouse remained. Simple, childlike, surrounded by fog. Beside it, Elara's wooden bird and the smooth gray stone rested side by side, like memories that no longer felt so alone. He ran his fingers over the cool surface of the stone. Its chill touched his skin, but his heart grew warmer. The hollow look in his eyes had faded. The days no longer echoed only with waves and light. The sea was still there. The wind still howled. But something within him had shifted. Elara was still here, not in form, but in Leah's gaze, in the tiny hand that had curled around his finger in the boat, in the warmth he thought he had lost forever. Now, the lighthouse wasn't just duty. It was a promise stretched across generations, a beacon for lost souls, a gesture of forgiveness, of love, that asked for nothing in return. Elias stood slowly and stepped out into the evening air. The sky was blushing purple. Far above, a lone seabird circled and vanished beyond the horizon. He didn't know what the tide might bring tomorrow. But tonight, as the lighthouse beam swept across the open water, he smiled. Because he knew, what had been lost may never return, but love had never truly left.